When Hester and I toured Europe last year, we spent a weekend in Strasbourg. My first ancestor, Josephus Wolmarans, came from there to South Africa in 1746. I've never been able to find my surname on the internet in other countries, and there I discovered the reason why. In the city archives, the last name of Josephus's parents is given as Wolmar. It seems he was not very literate. He arrived as a soldier, later became a stable boy, then a burgher, and finally he was issued with a brandy license in Rondebosch, where he established a distillery. My blood is not very blue, I'm sorry to say. But while in Strasbourg, we were struck with awe and wonder at the grandeur of the Notre Dame Cathedral. It towers over the city, being 142 meters high. Goethe described it as a sublimely towering, wide-spreading tree of God. It was built on the site of an ancient Roman temple used by soldiers, and in the 4th century it was devastated by the Christians, who refurbished it as a church. The construction of the current cathedral started in the 11th century. It took centuries to complete. And during the Reformation, it was vandalized by Protestant iconoclasts. The city council then assigned it to them, and in the 17th century, it was returned to the Catholics. The cathedral still bears the scars of various wars and natural disasters. Nothing lasts forever. Nothing is permanent. Rabbi, what large stones and what large buildings, exclaimed one of the disciples. Not one stone will be left here upon another, Jesus replied. All will be thrown down. It was only a few days before Jesus would be crucified, and that night, as a farewell message, he shared a terrible secret with his inner circle. It is about wars and famines and earthquakes and fake messiahs. And contrary to what you may believe, Jesus was not predicting the future, nor was he giving an end of history timeline. Essentially, Jesus was talking about the precariousness and the instability of human existence. And to do this, he made use of an apocalyptic framework. Apocalypse means revealing, telling a divine secret. And this way of thinking expects God to bring all oppression and unjust suffering to an end. The genre is very ancient. In the 8th century before our common era, the Greek poet Hesiod wrote a book. He called it Works and Days. And he was a pessimist. He was very, very despondent about the times he lived in, and really believed it to be the end of days. Why? Members of families, cheated each other. His own brother bribed judges to steal Hesiod's inheritance. Children refused to care for their parents. And he expected infants to be born soon with grey hair due to the hardship of the times. No stone would be left on another. It was his lament about the trying times he lived in. So talking apocalypse is therefore not really about prediction. It is a way of exposing the suffering and the hardship of the present. Milan Kundera called it the unbearable lightness of being, the title of his great novel about the Prague Spring of 1968, which led to the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union. Apocalypse is about the precariousness of life. Mainline, traditional, liberal Christianity gets nervous when Jesus talks apocalyptic. We prefer to see Jesus as an outstanding example who had been prepared to die for his convictions, or as a radical reformer who turned an outdated religion on its head, or as a great moral teacher, or as a spiritual leader who had compassion for the poor and the marginalized. And this is why we become uneasy when Jesus, during his last days, talks about our last days, when he declares that the things we admire with awe and wonder are destined for ruin. Perhaps this is why we admire buildings like the Notre Dame Cathedral with veneration and wonderment. It gives us an illusion of stability. We are seduced to think that at least some things remain the same. This may be the reason why we love to worship in church buildings who look at least 600 years older than they really are. We do this as a cure for the malady which the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death. The despair we feel because we are so precarious, so fragile, so mortal. The sheer size of the temple in Jerusalem, equivalent to about 14 rugby fields, inspired awe and wonder. For the Jews, it was a picture of heaven, but it was also a mirror of the status quo. The outer section of the temple was called the court of the Gentiles, meaning no goyim beyond this point. If your blood was pure, you could enter the next section, the court of women. And this was as far as Jewish females were allowed to go, provided they were not menstruating. The next section was the court of Israel, and it was for Jewish men only. It was adjacent to the court of priests, where liters and liters of blood were spilled daily in the sacred sacrifice of animals. And the core of the temple was called the Holy of Holies, God's residence. Only the high priest was allowed to go behind its heavy curtain once a year. A daily prayer reflected the temple's design. Blessed are you, Hashem, the name, King of the universe, for not having made me a Gentile or a slave or a woman. In the 70th year of our common era, the Roman general Titus, under orders from the Emperor Vespasian, sacked, looted, and razed the temple to the ground. 4 years earlier, the Jews, in an act of rebellion, closed the temple to Gentiles, and they also refused to make sacrifices to God for the emperor. This was a declaration of war. And after this cataclysmic event, things changed radically. The Jews stopped sacrificing animals. Christians developed their own places of worship, distinguishing themselves from Judaism, but many things remained the same. Shai Cohen of Harvard University has proven that after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and I quote him, Christianity excluded menstruants from the church. My grandmother told me that in her time, men and women sat separately in the church. The men on the right, of course, and the women on the left. And communion was first served to the males and only then to the females. And you may all remember that it was only in the late 16s, early 70s that females were finally allowed to become ministers in some churches. When I preached for the first time in the church in which I grew up, my then fiancée and now my wife decided she was not going to wear a hat. It upset everybody. My late father afterwards had a private conversation with me, and in which he said, the biggest sins in the church are introduced by the wives of ministers. It was a subtle hint, and of course I ignored him. In the apartheid years, this same denomination had ministers who refused people of color entrance to their churches, not even at funerals. I protested this by establishing a multicultural congregation, and life was made very difficult for me, and finally I resigned. You see, nothing is permanent. Perhaps this is why the story of Adam and Eve contained this prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge. Knowledge leads us to question the past and to renew things. When you gain knowledge, you gain something. There is growth, there is insight, there is new perspectives. but something is also destroyed. You have to unlearn the outdated understandings of the past. It stressed me at university to learn that the Tower of Babel was not the real reason why we have more than one language. That the earth was definitely not created in 6 days, that donkeys did not really talk, and that Jonah really could not have been swallowed by a big fish and survived in his belly for 3 days. So for me, university was no neat progress, no orderly development. It was a calamitous dismantlement, stone by stone, of previous structures of junk that filled my head. After 1994, all our history books were rewritten, and we realized that history as we had been taught in school was one-sided and propagandistic. And in my years as minister, I experienced the crises of faith which people went through: the death of a child, a medical diagnosis with the words, "Sorry, there's nothing we can do," or a severed spinal cord in a car accident. Things would never be the same again. And I came to realize that there is no new understanding of God without a departure. There is no grasping of faith without abandonment. There is no certainty without radical doubt. We, the earth we live on, the social structures we devised, were not built to last. The lightness of our being is unbearable. Perhaps I'm speaking too negative about life's endings. We call it death. Jesus calls it birth pangs. Viewed in his light, we should rather open ourselves up to new perspectives, debate them and discuss their merits. In this way, things that get broken might be fixed. Salaries not paid by municipalities, children abused at schools, the faithful abused by churches, patriarchy, homophobia. At the end of Jesus' life, he says, death is life, and endings, new beginnings. And so, yes, in the big and small crises of our lives, relationships will continue to end acrimoniously. Workers will be retrenched. Letters of rejection will be received, and loved ones will die. But by God's grace, these endings may become the birth pangs of new futures and new worlds waiting to be born. Nothing remains the same. My surname changed centuries ago. Sanctuaries are erased and replaced with new ones. From January next year, we will worship in a new building. It had originally been built as a church, but has now been refurbished as a conference center. I like the idea. Even faith and how we imagine God changes. There are still wars and rumors of wars, and earthquakes and wildfires and famines. These may be the beginning of the end, or the end of things destined to perish and decay. But they may also be the birth pangs of a new world. Of the temple in Jerusalem today, only the Wailing Wall remains. Looking at the ruins, the Jewish poet Yehuda Amichai wrote my favorite poem in 1996. It is about endings and new beginnings. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plough. And a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. Amen.